Hi, Yousef.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm not complaining. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and the audio podcast. You are Yousef Munayyer, the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Did I get the name right?
Yes, you did.
And we're going to talk about the Israeli election, which was today. And we're going to start by you're telling us what the state of play is at this moment. Polls closed probably a few hours ago. And then we're going to proceed to your telling us whether, from your point of view, it actually matters all that much which side winds up having what is needed to form a coalition and govern Israel. So what's your understanding of where we are after the election today?
Sure. Yeah. Let me just say a little bit up front to kind of contextualize this. We have these conversations every time that there is a election in Israel. There is a ton of debate and discussion around what the polls say, where the parties stand, what sort of coalition will be formed, so on and so forth. And all of this conversation tends to reinforce this idea that there is this vibrant, pluralistic, democratic system in the state of Israel. And of course, what gets forgotten and is not often mentioned and should be mentioned in times like this is that in the territory that Israel controls, there are 5 million Palestinians who are subject to the policies of the Israeli state, who have no voice whatsoever in these elections and in shaping the policies that ultimately they are subject to. And so I think that is important to kind of point out.
If I can just interrupt, so you're talking about the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. There's a different sense in which Israel ultimately controls the two. I mean, West Bank is actually occupied by Israeli troops. Gaza, Israel controls the borders in effect and controls what goes in and out. And so that's a slightly different form of control, but that's what you're talking about, right?
Exactly, yes, and of course in East Jerusalem as well, and for Palestinian citizens of Israel, including people like myself and many of my family members, we experience a second-class status of citizenship within what Israel terms to be itself as a Jewish state.
So, excuse me, are you actually a citizen of Israel?
I am. Yes.
I didn't realize that. Did you live there for any period of time?
Briefly, yes.
I see.
But
in Israel proper.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I was born there. My father was born there. My grandfather was born there. My great grandfather was born there. And so on and so forth. And we like to say we didn't cross the border crossed us. Among the population of Palestinian citizens of Israel, there are, about 1.5 to nearly 2 million today, who make up about 20% of the Israeli population, the population of Israeli citizens. And of course, these are Palestinians who remained within what became Israel after the Nakba, which was the depopulation of Palestine during the establishment of the Israeli state, in which the vast majority of the native inhabitants were not able to remain inside, but became refugees. All of that is a long way of saying, the conversation that tends to focus around the elections often creates the perception that there is this sort of robust democratic system, when in reality it's actually something very, very different than that in its totality. Today the elections have been held, and this election has very much been a referendum on Benjamin Netanyahu himself, and the question of the Palestinian issue, the question of peace, the question of military occupation and Palestinian rights have essentially been entirely absent from the agendas of almost every single party that is running in the election. The biggest sort of area of contention between the leading parties, which is Netanyahu's Likud party, and a newly formed sort of coalition of a couple different parties that have come together, led by the former Israeli Chief of Staff, Benjamin Gantz, has really focused on Netanyahu's overreach in terms of his grasp of power, his attempts to really weaken certain institutions within the Israeli state, corruption charges that he is facing, including recommendations of an indictment from the Attorney General. But there really hasn't been much debate or distinction drawn between the two main parties around the question of the Palestinians and their rights and the question of peace. Netanyahu has infamously been opposed to the idea of Palestinian sovereignty, a Palestinian state, and so on. But this new party has really been very vague in terms of what they would do if they were to govern. But what they have said so far and what their platform says is that they would retain control and continue to develop the settlements, that they would retain control over the Jordan Valley, which is, of course, amounting to 60% of the West Bank. They would never divide Jerusalem. They would always retain control of the Golan Heights, which we know Donald Trump has recently recognized Israeli sovereignty over, and that they would demand that Israel would remain in control of security in the entirety of the territory between the river and the sea. So that might be a more nuanced way of saying the same thing that Netanyahu has been saying for a very, very long time, which is he never wants to see an independent and sovereign Palestinian state there. So that question has really not been subject to debate in this election at all. In fact, the vast majority of the electorate in Israel seems to be behind this idea of perpetual occupation.
Okay. So before we delve into that future and what distinction there may or may not be between the two main candidates, what is your understanding of how the elections have, what we know about today's election? I just glanced at the headlines, and my sense is that even though Netanyahu may have not quite won the election, he may stand a better chance at actually forming a coalition government by virtue of which parties he is allied with?
That's the way it appears right now. So in the Israeli parliamentary system, there's 120 seats in the Israeli parliament that's called the Knesset. To govern a coalition needs to be able to have the support of 61, which is a majority, of course, of those 120 seats. There is a theoretical possibility of a minority government. It's never happened in the aftermath of an election, so that is very unlikely. And the two main parties are probably hovering somewhere between 30 and 35 seats each. So each of them will have to be able to cobble together a coalition of various partners to get to that 61. And the way that the political lay of the land is that most of the smaller parties are natural allies of Netanyahu. They're either other right-wing parties or religious parties that tend to have much more in common with the Likud than with their opponents in this election. So that's not to say that another outcome is not possible. It's just highly unlikely to see how a different sort of constellation could come together.
Okay. And you'll have to excuse me if one of my dogs starts barking even more disruptively than what we just heard, because there's some thunder approaching, and that could trigger barking. But so one way, this one distinction that became prominent in the American media's treatment of the election in its run-up flowed from Netanyahu. He did a series of kind of hardline things to try to stir up his base coming into the election. One of them is, as you said, to say, well, basically, we're going to annex the West Bank. At least we're going to annex all the settlements. And if you've been to the West Bank, you know that that would entail not only Israeli sovereignty over the settlements, if you recognize the annexation, but over all these roads that connect the settlements, and they would take all of that as theirs, and that kind of slices up the rest of the West Bank in ways that are at best inconvenient for the Palestinians living there, and so on. So in a way, it amounts to saying we're just gonna take the West Bank. And the way this was treated in the media was like, oh, so if Netanyahu wins, the two-state solution may be doomed. Am I correct in thinking that that your view is that for practical purposes, the two-state solution is doomed in any event, or is that too dark?
No, I don't see how it's possible. I don't think it ever really was possible. The reality is that the Israelis since 1967 have been building inside the West Bank settlements that have been built in strategic locations across the territory for a very specific purpose, to entrench their presence on the land. This has been going on now for over 50 years. The state of Israel itself is only 70 or so years old. So for the vast majority of the existence of the state, it has been entrenching its presence inside the territory that, a two-state formula would require it withdrawing from. It's just not going to happen. If it was to happen, it would require the kind of political will within Israel that could only be inspired by a significant amount of pressure from the outside, which we know has not been forthcoming. Certainly not from here in the United States, and largely because of the United States' refusal to allow that kind of pressure to come down on the Israeli state. So I don't see that happening. I don't think it's possible. And even if a withdrawal was possible, I don't think a simple, territorial solution is the only question that needs to be resolved. You still have other issues that need to be resolved that are beyond just the territorial issue. There's the question of Jerusalem, of course, and there's the question of the refugees, and there is, of course, the question of Palestinian citizens of Israel who are in a very precarious situation, living as a minority within a state that wants to define itself as Jewish, and in doing so, excluding them from many parts of the state and society. So, I think it was a long shot if it was ever possible, and certainly not possible anymore. And now the question that brings us to is, well, at what point are people going to wake up to that reality and begin, thinking about what comes beyond that? It seems to me that, Benjamin Netanyahu has already started, and other, members of the right wing in Israel have already begun, thinking about what an alternative reality is. They want to annex the West Bank. They want to, control that territory forever, make it part of the Israeli state. And that calls into question what happens to the Palestinians that are living there, the millions of Palestinians that are living there.
Do you think they've thought about that clearly, or they're just going to see what happens?
Well, look, I think they know what they don't want to happen, is that they don't want to incorporate Palestinians into Israeli society. So the options I think that they would consider plausible is some form of continued occupation, where they would continue to control the territory and not give the Palestinians their rights, or the 1948 option, which is to force the Palestinians off the land in the West Bank, and as members of the Israeli right have long said, to push the Palestinians into Jordan, which they believe is, a Palestinian state in their rhetoric. So, the interesting thing about this election, one of the interesting things about this election is that, a lot of these parties have tried to either mimic Netanyahu's policies or attack him from the right. And have really abandoned the idea of, creating a distinction from the left. His main opposition candidate debuted his election campaign by bragging about how many Palestinians he killed in the Gaza Strip. And his partner... In his
role in the military in, what was that, 2014?
Correct. And his partner is in the party, taunted Netanyahu for not going ahead and carrying out the demolition of a Palestinian village. So the opportunities to attack that they see are from the right for the most part, and I think that demonstrates that there's really no electorate there for a different perspective, a different solution than simply trying to out security Mr. Security in Benjamin Netanyahu.
So you don't buy the idea that, Netanyahu is this kind of passing right-wing nightmare. If he can just get voted out of office, things will get better. You see him as more or less a true expression of the Israeli electorate. I mean, not an exactly proportional expression, but as capturing too much genuine sentiment for things to fundamentally change even when he passes from the scene.
I think Netanyahu is a byproduct of the problem, not the problem himself. Yeah. I think the problem is that, the Israelis see every incentive to continue down the path that they're on. They've been able to lay claim to territory, whether it's in Jerusalem or the settlements or in the Golan Heights. And even though that is, initially rejected by the international community, if they hold it long enough, they have demonstrated that Washington will ultimately side with them and recognize their claims. And I think they feel that there's no consequences for them continuing down this path. I don't think you would be hearing Netanyahu talk about annexation today if the annexation of the Golan Heights was not recognized, if the annexation of Jerusalem was not recognized as Israel's capital, and so on. All of these different steps that they've taken have emboldened them.
There's a little more ambiguity in what the U.S. has done with Jerusalem, right? Because what Israel kind of annexed, was East Jerusalem, the Palestinian part of Jerusalem. The U.S. is moving its embassy to West Jerusalem, and so that's kind of a vaguer gesture. I mean, the recognition of sovereignty over Golan Heights is unequivocal. The traditional view has been that international law precludes Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights and over the West Bank. But in any event, I guess I mean, am I right about East Jerusalem, about the embassy being kind of a vaguer gesture?
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that. The Israeli expansion of the municipality of Jerusalem not only enveloped what was East Jerusalem prior to 1967, but also a significant amount of territory from the West Bank as well. And in doing so, within that expansion, enveloped hundreds of thousands of Palestinians as well. With the recognition, though, by the Trump administration of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and in the words of Donald Trump, taking Jerusalem off the table. The United States has weighed in on what was thought to be a major final status issue that could only be resolved by the parties themselves at the table. Mm-hmm. And in recognizing Israeli sovereignty there, Donald Trump has really shook up the foundations of what has been, peace process policy, and I think once again making clear that this two-state framework is really a thing of the past.
Do you have a theory as to why Trump has gone so hard right on Israel? I mean, you wouldn't have necessarily predicted this from anything he said as a candidate. And it was alleged that he was anti-Semitic, not that that's synonymous with being anti-Israel, but you wouldn't have necessarily predicted all of this, right? I mean, he has swung so far beyond what any other president has thought to be wise, any other U.S. president, right?
I'm not sure exactly what you could have predicted, but I think throughout his campaign, and particularly the people he put around him to advise him on this issue during the campaign, particularly in the summer of 2016, should have sent very, very, very loud alarm bells.
Like when he decided that his real estate lawyer was the best qualified to be ambassador to Israel, or is this before
his
that?
Bankruptcy lawyer. His
bankruptcy lawyer. I'm sorry. In that case, definitely, he's diplomatic.
Which is fitting. Right, and this is a person, who we put as his ambassador, which was the first person that he announced for an ambassadorship, David Friedman for ambassador to Israel. Really is from the extreme right when it comes, to the sort of the Zionist perspectives, and has been a pretty vocal advocate of the settlements, and very much an opponent of any form of peace with Palestinians. Believe he said Palestinians don't exist, and there was a whole litany of racist statements that he had made that came up during the congressional hearings around his appointment. And I believe he was maybe the only ambassador to Israel to be so controversial. I think, was a party line vote for his appointment. So I think, when David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt was now Trump's envoy to the Middle East, were excuse me, were named. Excuse me.
You want to get some water?
Sorry about that.
What happens? I can talk for a while if you want. I'm good at that.
So when the two of them were named, I think it became very clear at that point what direction he was taking. And I don't think this is necessarily out of any affinity for Israel or for Jewish people or anything like that. Of course, we know that Donald Trump has been, one of the most vocal supporters of white nationalism, and has really helped bring all of these crazy alt-right neo-Nazi characters out of the woodwork through his language, some of which has been coded, some of which has been very transparent and obvious. But I think really his overt support for Israel over the last couple of years has really been about sending a message to his base, which is primarily white evangelicals, for whom Israel is a very important issue. And of course, this is a constituency that is far more right-wing on this issue than the American Jewish community. Mm-hmm. But poll after poll continues to show that Donald Trump's very base, and the strongest parts of his base, are white evangelical Christians. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what he's been doing in terms of Israel policy has really been choreographed for that audience.
Now, can I ask you, are there people that you talk to who share more or less your perspective and aims on this issue, who are saying, perhaps a little cynically, but it would actually be better if Bibi Netanyahu continues to govern, because, he has kind of become, maybe the face of evil is putting it a little too strongly, but he's gotten very bad press. I would say some of it he's earned, but in any event, he's probably thought of less highly by Americans, certainly on left of center Americans, than any previous Israeli prime minister. Isn't it, isn't it in some sense tactically better for you if you view the policies emanating from either him or his opponent as being fundamentally the same? Isn't it better for you if things look as bad as possible?
It's an interesting question that you raise. In 2015, during the election, I wrote a piece in the New York Times that was titled "Netanyahu's Win is Good for Palestine." It wasn't the title that I chose, but nonetheless, you get the point. I think you're right to point out that Netanyahu has increasingly become recognized as the face of Israeli intransigence and belligerence, and that has increasingly won him allies on the extreme right and the far right, which unfortunately is rising in many places around the globe, where he's been able to develop some alliances, including in Eastern Europe and in Brazil and elsewhere. But among people who see the world a little bit differently, who value human rights and freedom and justice and equality, and among Americans who are on the other end of the political spectrum, Netanyahu has really become a very radioactive person. Now, I believe that it's not really about Netanyahu, the individual. It's really about the policies that he represents. However, they've really become synonymous in the American understanding. And it would probably take some time for people to realize that the policies have not shifted under new leadership. Mm-hmm. And so if you were to have a new, prime minister who was not going to shift policy in any serious way, I think there would be many people who would say, well, let's give this guy a chance. Because they're not really familiar with where they stand. But I think, though, over the long run, when they do become familiar with where they stand, those same trends will continue. What is alienating people is really a clear contrast in the values that people here in the United States hold dear. For example, democracy, equality before the law, freedom, human rights, and so on, and the values that are on display in Israeli policy, which is quite the opposite of that. So I think in the long run, even if there was to be a change in leadership, these trends of alienation, particularly among liberals, will continue because the situation on the ground is something that is fundamentally repulsive to people who value those kinds of things.
Now, one thing I thought I noticed more in the run-up to this election than maybe in the run-up to past Israeli elections was people on the left. I mean, people who, certainly people who share your perspective, noting that Palestinians are not allowed to vote in this election, at least those Palestinians who are not Israeli citizens, the ones in the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem. That seemed to me more of a talking point. Does that represent a shift of tactics? I mean, first of all, do you think I'm right? And more is being said about this as fundamentally as a political rights and human rights issue. And does that represent, if so, a shift of tactics and or a shift even in goals?
I think we have seen that more. And look, the entire idea of a two-state outcome and this idea of negotiations towards that end was to resolve this fundamental problem of the lack of sovereignty and the lack of self-determination for the millions of people who are living under military occupation. And so if that is not possible anymore, and if the powers that be, whether in Israel or in the United States, are not interested in that anymore, and I think it's very clear from Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump that this is not a priority anymore, then the question is, how do we resolve this question of self-determination and lack of sovereignty? So long as the two-state idea was plausible, the idea in people's minds was, well, it's just a matter of time. It needs to be resolved, and then there can be an answer to this. But if that goes out the window, then we're back to this question of there being millions of people who cannot vote for the government that rules over their lives. That is fundamentally undemocratic. And for the United States to be supporting that system in very, very significant ways is a big problem. And so I think you're going to increasingly hear this question raised as this two-state idea goes out the window. I think this is one of the reasons why the two-state idea and negotiations has been so useful for the Israelis. Look, the Israelis made decisions after 1967 to entrench their presence in this territory. And even if they wanted to pull out at this point, it's not an easy thing to do. It's a politically and economically very costly thing to do. And, it's very clearly undemocratic as well. It's very clearly illiberal as well. And so, the costs of this internationally were also going up. Mm-hmm. And so how do you balance these things? How do you try to diffuse the costs? Well, one of the ways that they were able to do that was to pursue an idea of a two-state solution with an undetermined endpoint. But as long as they were able to sell the notion that they were pursuing it to the international community and blame failures along the way on the Palestinians, then they can buy time. But what's happened now is that, it's become clear that the two-state emperor has no clothes, and time is up.
Now, there are still those on the Israeli side who say, well, the Palestinians had their chances. That's a talking point is, the joke on that side is, the Palestinians never pass up an opportunity to pass up an opportunity or whatever it is. So what would you say was lacking in even the most generous two-state proposal that was ever, there weren't many that were actually technically on the table, but there were offers that were kind of talked about, I guess it's thought that the most generous one, or the one that came closest maybe, was right before the second Intifada, around 2000, at the very end of the Clinton presidency. There was some offer, maybe never technically on the table, I don't know. But what would you say? Would you say that even the most, quote, generous offer has been sorely lacking in critical things that Palestinians would rightfully demand? Or would you just say, well, it's true that was a not bad deal, but the political moment wasn't right, or what? And if the former, what would you say has never been offered as part of any two-state deal to the Palestinians that is essential?
Yeah, well, I think one of the fundamental problems is that there is this idea that someone or something should be offering Palestinians their basic rights. That's not the way it's supposed to work. It's not something that should be offered. It's something that should be expected and granted and afforded without having to be offered by anybody else. And so what has been offered is different solutions that have afforded the Palestinians fractions of their rights. I think this has been unsatisfactory for a number of reasons. And we can go into all of those details.
Well, what's an example of some rights that were never offered, or some things that you would expect the state to have that were never going to be part of the state that was offered?
So you raised the I'm assuming you're referring to the Clinton parameters, which were before the second Intifada and so on. First of all, this was a framework that was put forward by an American president. It was not an offer from the Israelis. It didn't really say anything about what the Israelis were going to be committed to. It was merely a presentation of an American outline for what they thought would be good. Now, in doing so, there was very little clarity on what would happen with Jerusalem. There was no clarity whatsoever on the question of the refugees. The issue of Palestinian citizens of Israel was never addressed. At its most generous, even around the outlines of a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it was not really a sovereign entity. It was an entity that would always be subject to the security control of the Israelis. So this is what is presented as, this great offer that the Palestinians turned down, which, in fact, the Palestinian leadership at the time did not turn down. Their response to Clinton at the time was, we need clarifications on this. It wasn't an outright rejection. It wasn't an outright acceptance. It was, we need more clarification on this issue, before we can move forward here. And of course, we know that not long after that, the Israeli prime minister at the time lost an election, and a hard right candidate, and Ariel Sharon, was elected. And even though negotiations were carried forward at that point by, President George W. Bush at the time, even with Sharon, they fell apart shortly thereafter. So, even at its best case, an American offer, I think, did not come anywhere near the very minimum that Palestinians would need for there to be a real just solution here.
Okay, so so as we look forward, I mean, you don't think two-state is happening. You think that a lot of people in Israel would like the Palestinians remaining, particularly in the West Bank, I guess, to go to Jordan. What would you like to see happen? I mean, it would seem like one of the main alternatives on the table that might be satisfactory to you is something that I think a lot of Israelis find terrifying, which is, everyone, Palestinians in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, in your view, vote. I mean, I expect Israelis, if they were forced to give somebody the vote, they would like to at least exclude Gaza, right? Because because first of all, that's the part that's not under quite such technical occupation. And secondly, that would keep the Palestinian voting bloc from being a majority. But I assume you acknowledge that there's just massive resistance among the Israeli people to giving you your dream scenario. Well, maybe you can call it that, but in any event, something you'd find a lot better than what you've got, which is all the Palestinians I've described voting, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a dream scenario. I don't think that there are any great solutions here. I think there are some solutions that are much better than others. I don't think that this issue can be resolved until both people are afforded their basic human rights. And I think right now you see the mass denial of human rights to one party, which is the Palestinians. There are different ways that can be resolved. I don't think it's happening through territorial division. I think there's going to have to be compromises that are made. And I understand that the Israelis, don't like the idea that Palestinians might be treated as equals. There's also people that, don't like it if people of a different race move in next door to them. But that's not the kind of vision for a future of peace and justice that is going to be tenable. Nor should the human rights of Palestinians really be subject to Israeli desires. These are things that should be guaranteed under international law, and in fact are afforded under international law, but have not been enforced. I don't accept the idea that Palestinians voting is scary. I think Palestinians living under military occupation and being denied basic rights is scary.
Yeah, and we should say that it isn't just a matter of voting. I mean, they don't have due process of law. So if they're arrested or something, it's like, you may or may not get a clear idea of what's going on with them and so on. But on the point of the Israelis, I mean, don't you think that for some Israelis, a lot of Israelis, I suspect, it goes beyond not liking the idea of Palestinians voting? Don't you think a lot of them actually fear that if there was a majority Palestinian electorate, ultimately the Jews would be chased out of Israel? Don't you think that's actually a fear there, or am I wrong?
It may very well be a fear. There was a fear among Palestinians that when Zionists from Europe began to emigrate into Palestine in the beginning of the century, that their ultimate goal was to force the Palestinians out and create a Jewish state there at their expense. And ultimately, that's what the Zionist project achieved in Palestine. I think, as a people who has understood the tragedy of what being forced out of your homes is like, that's certainly not something that we would want to see. So I would speak for myself, but I would imagine for many Palestinians who've experienced this, would not want to wish that on anyone else. at the same time, again, the fears of others is not a reason, is not a justification for us to be denied our basic rights. So I don't think that should be acceptable anywhere, and certainly not in Israel and Palestine.
Okay, I guess final question, because I know you've got to go. If you imagine, I mean, you think, and I've heard this from other people, that an aspiration among some Israelis, including Netanyahu, is to get as many Palestinians as possible out of the West Bank into Jordan. What kinds of measures do you imagine them resorting to accomplish that? And is the situation there that they could do that with anything other than brutal and conspicuous ethnic cleansing? In other words, can you imagine them somehow setting up a set of incentives, maybe do some deal with the Jordanian government? I mean, I have no idea about the regional politics or what West Bank Palestinians might or might not do. Do you imagine there being a relatively subtle and inconspicuous way to accomplish that?
Well, I'll tell you how they did it in my hometown in 1948. At the time, was Israeli troops led by Yitzhak Rabin, who went on, of course, to be prime minister and participated in the Oslo Accords and so on, who besieged a town of tens of thousands of people until they ultimately were able to get the residents to give up, and then they rounded them up and shipped them out. And they did that with towns in the area, like by force, including through the use of massacres to intimidate the residents there and drive people out of their towns and villages. I don't think we can ever erase that possibility. And there is an opportunity for the Israelis to carry out something like that during a war or a conflict. We've seen it before. I would never rule out the possibility. And of course, these are things that we see across the globe. It's not limited to Israel and Palestine. But ethnic cleansing has taken place in situations of war. And one of my fears is that if there was to be some sort of significant war that takes place, that the Israelis might exploit that opportunity. I don't know how they would do it. I really don't want to imagine how they would do it. But I do know that the Israelis want to keep the geography, but they don't want the demography that's there. And there are lots of ways that they can try to pressure people to leave. But unless the Israelis are forced to have to reconcile that question, they may also just, accept the status quo for as long as they possibly can, and continue to occupy the territory, deny the people there their rights. If they're not pressured to end that, why would they? This is why I think, the real issue is international policy, and particularly American policy towards the issue. What this election shows us, if there was any doubt, is that there's no answer coming from the inside. Unless there is significant pressure from the outside, the Israelis are going to remain on this course and continue drifting rightward.
Okay. And I'm just curious, what is the name of the town that your ancestors lived in 1948?
In Lid. It's the town that I was born in as well.
Oh, so your parents stayed. They weren't driven out, or?
Internally displaced persons.
Okay. That's their technical designation. Okay.
Correct.
All right. So where can people find you, like on Twitter and whatever? What's your Twitter handle?
Sure. Twitter is Yousef Munayyer, at Yousef Munayyer, YOUSEF Also encourage people to check out our website for the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, which is uscpr.org.
Okay. And my Twitter handle is Robert Wright, or WRIGHTER. So thanks for taking the time. We don't yet know what's going to happen with this election, but your view is that it doesn't actually matter very much. Okay.
Indeed.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Okay.